It gives me great pleasure to introduce two experts in their field. And I think you'll really enjoy this conversation because it fits perfectly with what we talked about this morning. I'd like to introduce Bruce Katz on your right. He's the Vice President of the Brookings Institution and co-founder of the Brookings Metropolitan Policy Program, also co-author of the Metropolitan Revolution. He's also, I would consider him Dr. Innovation District, Mr. Innovation District. He's written the book on innovation districts globally, and I think he's got a lot of interesting things to say about how to foster innovation in some of our communities. To your left is Blair Levin. Blair was former FCC Chief of Staff, Executive Director of the National Broadband Plan, basically wrote the Broadband Plan along with a couple of other folks, and organized Gig.U, which led to a coalition of 36 research universities and more, and helped encourage some of the broadband developments we've seen recently. No less than the Chairman Wheeler said that no one's done more to advance broadband expansion and competition through the vision of National Broadband Plan and Gig.U than Blair. Thank you both for being here, and I appreciate it.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. I get to play the wonderful role of asking the first set of questions for Bruce, but I urge you to think about questions, and we'll go for 20 plus minutes and then open it up. I might note that both Bruce and I are, I think I would say, recovering federal bureaucrats.
Absolutely.
And we're kind of on, what, step 8 of that program or something like that. But both kind of found ourselves in some ways frustrated by the nature of policy development in Washington, D.C., and decided to go hang out with mayors who were more practical problem solvers in a variety of different ways. I've been more narrowly focused on what you might think of as the network side. Bruce has been focused, well, focused is actually probably the wrong word, now that I think about it.
Peripatetic.
Bruce has been dealing with the range of issues, but of course it is in the nature of cities that the purpose of the city is to do a variety of things, or not single purpose cities. And so the questions of economic development, transportation, housing, jobs, education, all of those things are all bound up together. One of the big themes of the last few years that let's just start talking about it, are innovation districts. So
Sure.
What are innovation districts? You have a lot of cities here. What are innovation districts? How do they develop and where are they going?
So over the last several years, my colleagues and I have first observed, now trying to capture and chronicle what we see as a shift in the spatial geography of innovation. If you go back 30 years and we were literally sitting in this room, if someone said, where's the innovative economy? You obviously would not go to Capitol Hill, but you'd get in a car and you'd drive, for half an hour, 45 minutes to a suburban corridor. And that's where you'd find innovative companies in sort of almost like a post-Cold War ecosystem. Each company, basically locating in an isolated facility, doing their R&D, whatever that looked like, and keeping their secret. And I think because of a shift towards an open networked innovation model, where companies to basically continuously improve their products or their services or their processes are sort of working with other companies, individuals, researchers, investors. What's happened is we have revalued proximity, we've revalued density, and with the millennial shift to communities that want live, work, and play, we've revalued, authenticity and vitality. And so what's happening, in our view, both in the United States and Europe, we could have a larger conversation about Asia or Latin America, is that the spatial geography of innovation is collapsing back to the cores of central cities, both to be close to a rich research and innovation environment that usually tends to congregate around advanced research institutions, medical campuses, companies with large R&D, that is really connected by transit and wired by fiber, but in really urban environments, or it's staying in suburban communities that are urbanizing, so that they have the amenities and the vitality where they can attract innovative firms and talented workers. So an innovation district really at the end of the day is about this concentration and co-location of big innovation assets like your universities, medical campus, and so forth, with this broader ecosystem of entrepreneurs, investors, researchers, incubators, accelerators. It's that whole ecosystem collapsed into a relatively small geography of the metropolis. And in our view, that tends to accelerate the discovery and the commercialization of ideas for the market. The US is never a place that only does, one thing. So in a way, we probably over-decentralized our innovation economy. And now we're balancing it out in many respects. So it's urban and suburban, but this sort of uniform nature of proximity and density, I think it matters more today. Placemaking in many respects from the urban side, it matters more today than probably at any time since the end of the Second World War.
So give us a couple quick examples of places where we see it happening, and also where 5 years from now we'll say it wasn't happening back in 2015, but it is sure is happening in 2020.
Yes, I think you have basically three models of what's going on in the US, and even as I say this, I think there are others that are playing themselves out, right? First model, someone once said, if you want a great economy, build an advanced research university and wait 50 years, right? So Kendall Square, MIT, close to Harvard, close to Mass General. If you haven't been to Kendall Square in Cambridge, it's remarkable. It's gone off like a rocket, hit a tipping point. University City, Drexel, UPenn, University City Science Center, Midtown Atlanta, Georgia Tech, Oakland neighborhood in Pittsburgh, Carnegie Mellon, UPitt, UPMC, University Circle in Cleveland, Case Western, Cleveland Clinic. I mean, that's your anchor-based districts where you have large amounts of federal R&D, basic science, applied research, and commercialization of those ideas. And then you have all the other urban revitalization, rejuvenation happening around that because of the demand for companies and workers for urban amenities. Number two, you're in San Francisco, you're in Seattle, you're in New York City, your market is hot, you're in Boston. So the Kendall Squares overheat, and basically the innovative economy jumps out into an older industrial underutilized area like South Lake Union, like the Brooklyn Navy Yard, like increasingly Hunters Point will be in San Francisco, like the Seaport in Boston. And that becomes to be a new innovation hub where anchor institutions actually relocate a bit of their broader advanced ecosystem, like UW Medical Campus moves into South Lake Union. Carnegie Mellon Integrative Media moves into the Brooklyn Navy Yard. And so you begin to redevelop, rejuvenate older parts of the city. And the third model is basically what's going on in Research Triangle Park. 7,000 acres basically carved out of a pine forest 40 miles from anywhere. And then 500 acres are being urbanized, live, work, play, bike, connect, because of the need or the demand of innovative companies and talented workers for this mashup kind of bump and mingle kind of space. So those are the models emerging in the US, they're emerging in Europe as well. I mean, if you go to Stockholm, Kista Science City, or Stockholm Life, you go to the Manchester in England, the Manchester Corridor, you go to Barcelona, 22 at Barcelona. I think there may be another model emerging which may be more just organic entrepreneurial tech, small company, that happens in part because of the kind of infrastructure work that's going on that you all are involved in. But it may not have these anchor institutions. And those anchors, again, could be the universities or the companies. But that's still to be played out.
As you described it, it almost sounds like these are organic things that happen in part because of cultural changes. And
Totally.
But what role did policy play? Were there certain mayors who, Barcelona, for example, seemed much more like a conscious thing?
Yeah, Europe tends to always do things a bit more purposefully and intentionally than us, which is a fairly chaotic society. And that may be a good thing. I would say in Boston, Mayor Menino, the famed urban mechanic, famously declared the Seaport as an innovation district. And he didn't overthink it in saying, well, these are going to be the 5 clusters and these are going to be the 3. He basically said, this is an area that has incredible amenities. It's now been opened up because of the tear down of the freeways, the big dig, to the entire city. Logan Airport's, literally you can see Logan Airport from across the seaport. So it really was an invitation to the broader innovation community in the Boston metropolis to invent something in this very real, very gritty, very authentic kind of place. For the most part, this has been the activities loosely connected of many disparate actors, the anchor institutions, real estate developers, investors, sometimes city government, sometimes nonprofit community development groups, loosely affiliated that organically have begun to benefit from what are big macro forces: demographic transformation, people revaluing cities and city living, and this move to open innovation, which I think we've talked a little about, but we haven't really quite understood how much this would change the location decisions of big companies. And big companies, take Pfizer in the pharmaceutical sector, are leaving suburban R&D facilities and moving close to be near the secret sauce, in Pfizer's case, MIT. They need to be ideas and they need to be near talent. So a lot of this, I think, it's in this country in particular, incredibly organic, and now policy can come in and begin to channel, accelerate, amplify, broaden, and make sure that as we grow these very innovative economies, they have the potential to be inclusive and to share some of the prosperity that they're generating.
So let's follow up on that and frame the question this way. The mayor of Louisville.
Right.
A thriving community that has a lot of health,
Sure.
Health facilities, has a big university, has a basketball team going to the Sweet 16, all that kind of stuff because they're part of the ACC. I had to throw in the ACC plug. 10 years in North Carolina does that to someone. You get a half an hour with the mayor. Tell us the first minute of your, or the first 3 or 4 minutes of your conversation, giving advice to that mayor. It's not been seen as an innovative city, but the mayor wants it to be. So,
yeah. So I mean, the one thing about innovation districts is they tend to be reflective of their broader regional economy in terms of what they're innovating on. So Louisville is an advanced manufacturing economy and a health economy. So if you go to the University of Louisville today, there is this maker space called First Build, which has basically been capitalized by GE Appliances. I mean, it's not a full-flung innovation district, but it basically reflects this move towards open innovation by a global company that used to do all of its R&D internally and now is trying to outsource it to a broader segment of both quote-unquote experts, but others just in the community that are tinkerers, makers. I would say the first thing is to understand what organically, how your economy, based on its particular clusters and advanced industries, how it's spatially organizing itself. I mean, has it organized itself in a particular way where these hubs and enclaves and districts that can be defined, by certain borders and boundaries, that you can sort of name it, you can label it, you can begin to understand, the kind of activity underway, and then you can begin to expand it out. I would say that in most parts of the United States, there may only be, in a particular metro, only 1 or 2 of these true innovation hubs. Everything else is more of an activity center. If you have a transit line built out and a lot of housing and retail built around it, that's not an innovation hub. That's an activity center. So you're really trying to find those places in your region where the economy has essentially spatially organized itself, sometimes with purposeful location decisions by either companies or large universities, but most of the time just by sort of accidental or legacy decisions. So, I mean, evidence, metrics, data, true analytics is the basis of this. I mean, part of the reason with declaring anything an innovation district is the real estate community then just says, great, that's a great label. We're going to get a price premium on anything we label. And then suddenly you see innovation districts popping up all over the United States when you really don't have the basis to make that declaration. It's almost like a field of dreams, build it and they will come. So,
you didn't copyright the certification for innovation districts? It would have been such a good business model for
this
you.
was obviously a really dumb idea, but in any event, so I would say to mayors or to chambers or to universities or to philanthropies or anyone in this space of regional economic development, the evidence will lead you ultimately. Evidence on clusters, evidence on advanced industries, evidence on spatial geography, it will lead you essentially to a true enclave. And if you don't have it, then you got a bigger issue. I mean, then
well, speaking of bigger issues, one of the things, when we started Gig.U, the idea was, let's start the prairie fire somewhere. Let's try to do it in the easiest place where there's, where there's material where you can throw a match on and start something. University towns were a logical one, high density, high demand, pre-existing network assets, et cetera. And you didn't have to explain that much.
Right.
But in conversations with mayors of cities either adjacent to or surrounding, their first thought is, look, this all sounds great, but this is like 5 jobs for, a couple guys from coming out of computer engineering. How does it translate into a multiplier effect for the city overall? Yeah. And how do you do that kind of matching jobs and training, and how do you make it part of a real larger theme for a city?
Yeah, so I think there's really a sort of a misunderstanding, I think, of the broader innovation in the STEM economy. First of all, it's much bigger than we think. In our view, the STEM economy, STEAM economy, if you want to put arts into the middle of science, technology, engineering, and math, is at least 20% of the American economy, and moving up in some respects. And about half of the jobs in that economy can be filled by people coming out of high schools or community colleges or business-run training efforts with special skills. This is not an exclusive economy. It's actually an inclusive economy if you sort of name it right, and if you have your systems around skills basically aligned with your particular clusters in advanced industries. So, that's number one, is the innovation economy is really a prerequisite for broadly shared prosperity. Number two, when you supercharge your innovation economy, for every 1 job in that economy, you're basically having a multiplier effect of 5. Because a bunch of companies get created or expand to serve the innovation economy, and then there's a consumption effect. Because the wage premium in these companies are so much bigger, people just get paid more to make quality products or provide quality services. There's a consumption effect, there's a housing effect, there's a retail effect. So if you want to grow jobs, essentially, in any American metropolis, the way to do it is to figure out your advanced industries, your STEM sectors, and then put them on steroids. And today, the way to put them on steroids is in part to focus on this spatial geography, which is relatively small. I mean, these are, our American metros are very large from a physical perspective because we were the land of sprawl, right? But these places, maybe 2% of the land mass, 3% of the land mass in a given city, they may be 50% of the jobs. And once you're at that kind of employment density, and you're bringing in residential density, and you're bringing in this innovation effect, there's sort of no limits, really, to the kind of jobs you could create or the tax revenue you could generate for the broader populace and citizenry.
Yeah. I'm going to ask a couple more questions, but please have some questions ready. I want to now take this into a very specific city that we were talking about at lunch, because I think it raises, it's the hard case, but it raises up a lot of different ones. Instead of talking about Silicon Valley, which would be the the one that kind of, in some sense, spawned a lot of these things, though interestingly in the sprawl, Detroit.
Right.
And I know you've done a lot of work there. How do you see these kinds of themes playing out in Detroit?
So Detroit is somewhat emblematic. I mean, a lot of American cities actually look the same when you think about it. They have a downtown, they have a riverfront. We tended to build our cities along rivers. They tended to have a corridor into what we would call a midtown area. And in the Midtown area, they would locate a lot of their anchor institutions, cultural institutions, and so forth. Detroit looks exactly like that. The downtown, basically, the Detroit River, Canada sits to the south. It was the headquarters zone. It now has the typical sports stadium, entertainment venue. You go up the famed Woodward Corridor into Midtown, and that's when you find Henry Ford Health, Wayne State, College for Creative Studies, Detroit medical campuses. I mean, it's about 3% of the land mass of the entire city. Detroit's really big, about 138 square miles. This is only about 4 to 7 square miles, depending on how you calculate it. I mean, this is where Detroit is coming back. It's coming back because of these macro forces, which are revaluing proximity, density, access to anchors. It's also coming back in part because one very entrepreneurial billionaire, Dan Gilbert in Quicken Loans, decided to basically buy up a large portion of the downtown, 60 buildings, and is really beginning to build a tech hub in the core of the downtown because he's able to sort of appeal to a lot of people either living in the Detroit metropolis, which is a very STEM-intensive metropolis because of the auto sector, they're computers on wheels. He's able to appeal to a certain segment of that workforce, come down to this gritty, authentic place, build a company, participate in building a company, and build a city at the same time. He's appealing to a very different generation in many respects. So Detroit is seeing this uptick of not just residential or job growth within this relatively small part of the city, but also investment from local capital that's unlocked to invest, and then institutional capital, which comes out from the outside. Because it's Detroit and because the city was bankrupt, what you see is the organic private and civic sectors really organizing and marshaling assets for the growth of this area. And now with a new mayor, Mayor Duggan, he's actually designated this area as an innovation district and basically convened the network of stakeholders and basically said, how do we amplify it, accelerate it, and really build on what the market was doing, along with this smart investment anyway. Very good for the city. I mean, people talk about the disconnect between the neighborhoods and the downtowns. Well, what you want is a very robust and vital core, which then spills off the jobs and the tax revenue, and then smartly connects people in the communities so that you can grow together. I mean, I don't see this as a either or, but a both and.
But a lot of people do see it as either or, and that's part of the problem.
I think it's just again, urban economies, regional economies operate in a certain kind of way where the innovative economy is very, very concentrated, highly concentrated. Whether it's in a city or whether it's in a suburban corridor, the question then becomes, how do you ensure that the benefits of that concentration are more broadly shared through skills, through connective, internet, through regeneration of housing and so forth.
Yeah. Let me open it up to questions, though I just do have to make a comment. You mentioned that cars were basically computers on wheels. We who have an FCC heritage tend to think of them as smartphones on wheels, or that they will be sometime in the future. I want to explore, are there questions, I'm happy to, question right there. Can you wait for 1 second so that others can hear you?
Laura Lane from Broadband, Illinois. Can you say more about the spatial geography and what the infrastructure is going to look like to really nail that?
Well, if you think about the infrastructure of a sort of 1970s science park, right? The infrastructure was roads. I mean, that was basically the infrastructure.
And water and sewer.
And water, sewer, right, the hidden infrastructure.
Right.
All subsidized,
right.
In many different ways. If you think about the infrastructure of a 21st century district, irrespective of whether it's city or suburban, it's transit, because that tends to be the spine of a lot of these places. I mean, think Kendall Square in Cambridge. That's the most innovative mile of a transit system in the world, because it's Harvard to MIT to Mass General to the Boston Seaport. I mean, there's no other, transit system like that. It's fiber and internet connectivity. And then it's the smaller living, biking, walking. I mean, it's the true organic kind of city. I mean, if you go to Hafen City in Hamburg, which is the build out of their downtown, their self-styled innovation district, there's more focus on walking than on any other physical aspect. So the new infrastructure for the 21st century basically is meant to encourage spontaneous collisions between people so that ideas can be shared and discoveries for the market can be accelerated. When again, the 20th century was basically celebrated isolation and exclusion in many respects. So I think that's, in a nutshell. And then the question is just, if you don't have it, how do you design it? How do you finance it? How do you deliver it? But because we're just talking about a completely different perspective of the way in which innovation occurs in a networked economy.
I might add that I think 10 years from now, we'll look at data as infrastructure. It doesn't kind of fit the normal, but think of a city that had all that but didn't share its data or didn't use its data or create a data platform. Perfect. Versus one that did. That kind of shared resource will become essential to how we do transportation, public safety, healthcare. There was a question back there. Yes.
Hi, Mitzi Herrera from Montgomery County, Maryland, which is adjacent to Washington, D.C. We have many areas where we have innovation happening, but we have two areas in particular where we have a lot of economic development centered around taking 1950s office spaces, moving the roads closer, landscaping, bus rapid transit. One area we have fiber. When we're getting more fiber, we have an anchor institution of a federal agency for FDA in one. We have NIST and Johns Hopkins and the Universities of Maryland and Shady Grove in the other. The question I have is, the things you just mentioned about infrastructure, by and large, we're moving on the transit, we're moving on the fiber, we're moving on walkable and open spaces. But if I had to say today that I want to attract businesses to those innovators who are legitimately companies that need 100 gigabit to true test beds for these kinds of applications, who legitimately will have gigabit needs over the next 2 to 5 years. And not because they want lightning speed email. Right?
Right.
And we have some large data centers that are in those areas as well. What can you say about ways in which either you've built it and you need them to come, or how do you find the businesses that you really need to get there once you've sort of set the table?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of this, will relate to your particular clusters and competencies, right? I mean, this region, when you think about the broader DC metropolis, cyber, is obviously going to be a huge competitive advantage for this region. We do have a lot of these federal agencies that are the platform for broad national research and R&D. The question is how much of that really spills over into the local economy, not from a procurement perspective, from a pure innovative perspective. So, from my perspective, you probably first want to inventory, and this is where national data doesn't really work. National data can give you some sense of what advanced industries, the R&D fueled, the STEM fueled industries you have. But then you want to get to the granularity of it all, the precision of it all, and do the sort of qualitative analysis of which companies are there, right? What's their growth trajectory? What has been their growth trajectory? What does it look like? And who else do they think, whether it's American or European or global, should be in this space? Naturally, because you're building a thick ecosystem, essentially. You're building a thick labor market. Once you have that, then it's the gift that keeps on giving. So I think this is, again, why when you started with the mayor of Louisville, it's all about who are you? I mean, this is the Dolly Parton line, right? Figure out who you are and do it on purpose. You know, don't try to be someone else. Don't try to be Silicon Valley. Good luck, it ain't gonna happen, right? So I think this really does require this kind of deep qualitative investigation, because I think that's likely to give you a sense of, A, what's the market already telling you, and then B, that gives you a sense of, you know, which paths to pursue. I think you have a follow-up. Yeah.
So, because I think this applies to a lot of people in this room.
Yeah.
So an interesting thing is, I think that I saw a statistic, there's maybe 38,000 businesses in the county. Only 200 of them have more than 200 employees.
Yeah.
And something like 15, 20,000 of them are 1 and 2 person
Sure.
startup consulting types of businesses. So do you have any advice, particularly when it does seem like a big bunch of our drivers are individuals?
Well, it depends on what sector of, you know, I mean, yeah, so there's that. I think in any given economy, you may not see the complete similar patterns, but so this is really about not doing the full inventory of business, but sort of, you know, narrowing it down to advanced industries. Okay, advanced industries are basically those. There's only about 50 sectors in the US economy which we would say basically qualify as advanced industries, right? They're high R&D and they're high STEM. I mean, they basically live on STEM workers. So I would, of all the businesses you all have in Montgomery County or anyone else in this room, what are your advanced industries? And we could tell you that from Brookings. And then second, well, where are they located? And then as you're basically positing, what's their size? I mean, what's, you know, and then who do they relate to? Because they're in an ecosystem. They're not off by themselves. They're engaging with your universities, you know, one way or another. They're engaging, perhaps, depending on the sector, with your medical campuses. So you want to draw that map of your ecosystem, of this advanced ecosystem, because if you really want to grow a 21st century economy that has stability and resiliency and sustainability, and you got to operate from this base. Not everything is equal, is when it comes down. I mean, this is that segment. It's only about 9% of the jobs in the United States. It's about 20% of the GDP. But off of it, an enormous amount of our growth is happening. This is what we trade with the world, essentially. So.
Yeah, Mark. Mike's right there.
So Marv Schwartz from One Community, and we're here in part thinking about how to get a national broadband infrastructure that is gigabit. And if we had that, does that allow, is it possible to distribute that innovative small geography zone to a much larger area?
I mean, I think as a natural matter, you know, these small hubs of innovation activity are radiating out. I mean, they are. I mean, this goes back to our conversation of downtowns versus the neighborhoods. I mean, these tend to be the places where a high portion of the well-paying jobs are concentrated, where market discoveries are being made. I mean, you can track patents and a whole bunch of other things. So there's a radiating effect happening from these really small places around jobs, around tax revenue, around investment. And you know, part of the political challenge, frankly, it's not a market challenge, it's more of a political challenge, is how do you understand what do those places need to perform at their highest level, you know, given disruptive market dynamics, you know? And how do you really purposefully connect them? Because the difference between urban innovation districts and suburban innovation corridors, let's say, is urban innovation districts are usually like 5 blocks away from some of the poorest neighborhoods in the country. You know, where suburban innovation corridors were out of sight, out of mind. So there is an opportunity right now, as we're growing these very substantial urban enclaves around innovation and around the advanced economy, to bring more people along for the ride. It won't just happen. It won't just happen. It has to be an intentional act, starting in really pre-K through 12, moving on up into the community colleges or the skills efforts, thinking about the rejuvenation of adjoining neighborhoods. The place that's most focused on this in the United States right now is Philadelphia. Because if you go into University City on the Drexel end, you come into 30th Street, you fall out of 30th Street, you're in Drexel. 10 blocks away from Drexel is the Mantua neighborhood. It's one of the poorest neighborhoods in Philly. So Drexel is growing out. University City is growing remarkably because of all their innovation assets. How do you bring a very deprived community along for the ride? I mean, it comes down to the block and tackle of housing and education and skills and connectivity. And I mean, that's it. I mean, it's not like a rocket science. It's just the granularity of how you do it in this particular place. I hope that's responsive. Yeah.
I might add, Marv, one of the things that's interesting, we all know we buy roads as a community, we buy electricity as a community, we buy water and sewer as a community. Everybody believes they buy broadband as an individual.
Right.
They don't. They actually buy based on the choices that the community's choices create for them. And so what we see is, for example, Elise Cohen out here ran the North Carolina Next Generation Network project. As a result, everybody in the Research Triangle Park area and in others will have choices they don't have today that radiate out and have an impact because if you're bringing the fiber in here, well, you might as well bring it in there. And then there are ways of throwing that off too because you've created all kinds of other bandwidth. Go ahead.
Thanks. This is really interesting. My question is, you talk about people and the sort of intersection or smashing together of ideas, and that being kind of the core of innovation in some way. But then most of the time you spend talking about infrastructure, like the geography, like where the district is, the infrastructure of the broadband, et cetera. Do we know enough about the social infrastructure that we need, like the sort of social movements of pulling people together? I mean, the open innovation stuff, a lot of it works of the open source sort of ethos and the people involved. So I'm wondering about where do the people play into this? And
I think it's a great question because I think at the end of the day, what makes innovation districts different from the prior innovation economy is you really have three assets that are brought together. The economic assets, your anchors, your entrepreneurs, your companies, investors, your physical assets, which we've focused on a lot, the infrastructure, but then just the vitality, the vibrancy of the place. I mean, this placemaking matters to innovation in ways today that it didn't 15, 20 years ago. The third part is networking. And networking really comes down to two kinds of things. One are strong ties, where you tend to have people with the same discipline, same expertise, basically connecting to each other within companies and across companies. A lot of this can be programmed, essentially. But the interesting part about innovation districts is there are a lot of weak ties. So you could have people from a particular sector, with particular kind of expertise, but then connecting to people in different sectors, or the support of marketing and the legal aspect, the mentoring that happens in the growth of companies. And I think that's what's happening a lot in innovation districts. It sort of reflects a convergence economy, where it's not just one sector of the economy continuing along its particular path, which is sort of logical and linear, but different sectors of the economy that happen to be located in the same region beginning to bump into each other, and that's where real discoveries begin to happen. So networking is fundamental. That's the people side of it. But it does require also a level of intentionality. Now, some of that will happen in vibrant and vital places anyway. People spill out of their companies. They want to be mingling together, in sort of programmed areas, where you're, having almost daily or weekly sort of events, But then there's almost like a need for entities that just sort of do this for a living. I mean, in a way, incubators, accelerators, constant, whatever we call these things. I mean, they're a way they're providing this kind of programmed way for networking. So, I mean, this is different, I think, because again, you go back to the suburban style model of isolation and exclusion. This was not really happening. I mean, the model worked, right? I mean, that was what that period of our economic development demanded. This is radically different. So not surprisingly, the spatial geography is shifting to adapt essentially market demand and demographic demand.
Other, yeah, in the back.
Hi, Blair. You
Joe.
mentioned Philadelphia and Mayor Menino. With what's happening in Philadelphia in and around Drexel creates some interesting opportunities in the delivery of public safety services. I was wondering where the thought leadership on delivering public safety services in this new era.
I know the answer to that. It's the person holding the mic. Isn't that what you're doing?
I look to leaders like you to help me
No,
point me
I'm
to
looking
it.
at you, man.
I'll have an answer after you answer the question.
Okay. Joe works at the Department of Justice on these things, and very grateful for what you've been doing. Well, let me take a quick look at it and simply say we just celebrated the 5th anniversary of the National Broadband Plan. There are a lot of things that have happened that I wouldn't have anticipated, some that I would have thought would have happened but haven't. But one thing I didn't think would happen yet, but I have a high level of confidence within 5 years will, the 911 system as we know it will be completely blown up and replaced by something much better, much more wonderful, and there will be horrible tragedies that I don't want to predict, where the number of people killed will be significantly less, or there will be certain things like Katrina's where the ability to respond with the cities will become much more resilient. Because if you think about it, 911, which was basically built in the 1960s on this PSTN voice-centric model, and that is the way it operates today, does not have, I've been working a little bit with a group of Harvard and MIT geniuses who basically one click, it goes to 911, immediately gives you right where the event is. You can send videos, you can send hospital records, all kinds of different things that you want to happen very, very quickly. So that would be a version on kind of an individual basis. But the Internet of Things, what we might think of as the civic version. Jeff Immelt of GE talks about the industrial Internet of Things, about how we manufacture. But there's a civic version of that where public safety and public health play very, very large roles, and we can kind of see a version of what the cops did to make America much safer by concentrating forces where they really were needed. The ability to do that will increase massively.
No, I think law enforcement in the U.S. was quicker to do what essentially we would call big data analytics, and then use it to basically deploy their resources in very targeted ways. I think that's now moving into a whole broader, scheme of, what we would call the social side of cities, right? So I don't think Philadelphia would be any different from another major city in the United States in terms of the technological capacity to be, really smart about how using essentially scarce resources,
Blair, I think we have time for one more.
Okay, I think there was one more question back there. Great.
Richard Weinberg, USC in Los Angeles. And the big new innovation district in Southern California is called Silicon Beach now,
right?
Which is really based on the creative industries.
Yeah.
So the animation, movies, music, visual effects, interactive games. And I was wondering if you see this type of district evolving in different ways in the other districts that you're looking at? Because it is more of a STEAM area than a STEM area.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot more T-shirts and shorts.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great question, and that's why, my attitude about the work we do at Brookings is it's sort of an evolving work in progress in a sense. Because I think the districts we were looking at initially, really had this sort of advanced research institution as its core. Now you could argue, essentially, that what's going on in Silicon Beach is building off of advanced R&D, maybe coming more out of companies than maybe out of universities exclusively. But so I would say probably the things that might be shared with some of these other districts is the cityness, essentially. I mean, cityness is a word that Saskia Sassen invented. It really is about those characteristics of a city, proximity, density, amenities, authenticity, that tend to now be valued by the market. They were discarded by the market for decades, particularly in this country. They were never really discarded in Europe, but they're coming back. So those characteristics will be shared. But I think as we go forward, I think what would be a rich, kind of research to do is how do you compare, the Kendall Square MIT area or even Carnegie Mellon or Georgia Tech, right? The engineering, computer science, Mathematica kind of focus versus these really creative enclaves. And I think we're only at the beginning of these enclaves really being grown. And that's where, US Ignite and, Gig.U, and I mean, all these, I think we're really on the verge of sort of a creative spurt that's happening in the US because of the convergence of technologies, the convergence of clusters. It won't be a ubiquitous trend, though. It'll be highly concentrated. So I think places really need to pay attention to this spatial geography and not say, oh, isn't it terrible this is happening, but see it as a platform for broader-based prosperity for their communities. I hope that's responsive. Yeah.
I'm going to answer it in a slightly different way. But one of the things that's always struck me, I would argue, having now listened to you, that Hollywood may have been the first innovation district. It was 100 years ago, but the innovation wasn't so much the technology which was available around the world. It was the marriage of technology with narrative. And that one of the things that's really interesting about the data revolution is how much we get an overload. And what really works is when you have a company like Nest, or Apple in some ways does this, that allows us to, in some very nice way, see the narrative of our energy data, for example. And where I think Los Angeles has a particular advantage is they have people skilled in the art of narrative, so that the big technology at South by Southwest, which crashed a whole bunch of networks, was Meerkat. And for those of you who don't know, Meerkat is a technology that, if you think of Twitter as enabling broadcasting of 140 characters, think of Meerkat as a technology that enables 4K streaming video for as long as full-form video. So, our friends at MCNC who have to stream the basketball games this weekend, if you have everybody in the stadium with their iPhone just streaming the video, and you have 20,000 people, 20,000 different streams you could watch, how does someone put that together in an actual narrative that is coherent and makes sense? So it's that kind of marriage that Silicon Beach, I think, in particular, will have an advantage because of that proximity of people who know how to do that. With
That's
that,
great.
please join me in thanking Bruce.
I must say, I'm sitting here listening to two people who are world leaders in their fields, and I can't tell you thanks enough for joining us and enlightening us. I also can't thank you enough for your service to this country, because you both have done wonderful things to move us in the right direction. And Bruce, in innovation, I'm dying to read your book, and now that I can learn more about it. And Blair, I'd like you to know that Lev led us in celebrating the 5th anniversary of the Broadband plan this morning, so we salute you. Well, yeah, sorry, you missed it, so you weren't here. Anyway, thanks again. That's great. Really, really, really good. Thank you.